Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Vivian M. Cook, and I am a regenerative agriculture specialist with the Iowa State University Bioeconomy Institute here on campus. We are so excited that you are all here tonight for Dr. Marcelo Mena's lecture, Methane Reduction, the Fastest Way to Reduce Global Warming. Dr. Mena is the opening keynote speaker for the Anaerobic Digestion on the Farm conference, which is hosted at ISU today through Wednesday in partnership with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 7 and the University of Iowa. We want to give a huge thank you also to Amanda Knief, Laura Beatty, and the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by student government, for co-sponsoring this keynote as part of the ISU Lectures program. Their partnership has made it possible for the lecture tonight to be open to not only conference attendees, but to the broader Iowa State University and Ames community. And on behalf of our conference planning committee, we are so glad you are all here. So a huge thank you to the Lectures program and to our co-hosts at this conference. We would like to begin this event today with a land acknowledgement. This lecture and the Anaerobic Digestion on the Farm conference are taking place on the ancestral lands of the Bakoje, or Iowa, the Sauk, and the Meskwaki nations. As we engage in discussions about agriculture, sustainability, and land stewardship tonight and in the coming days, it is critical that we acknowledge the leadership of Indigenous communities in agriculture, sustainability, and land stewardship, and also the history of forced removal and the ongoing inequities that Indigenous communities face in Iowa and beyond. During tonight's program and this week's conference, we encourage all attendees to recognize this context, discuss this history, and engage in conversations about environmental justice as it relates to anaerobic digestion. Now, before we begin, a few housekeeping items. One, there will be an opportunity to ask Dr. Mena questions after his talk. Please note that there will be a microphone that we'd love for people to use, so we will be running around and making sure everybody who has a question can use the mic, so just look for us. Please do not use a flash if you are taking pictures. If you leave before the Q&A is finished, please just exit quietly out those doors and refrain from talking until you leave the room. Lectures program student worker will be in the hall just outside the room here to scan your student IDs if you're a student and you're here for class credit. So card scanning will not start until after the lecture is finished. So you'll be here for the whole thing, which we're very happy you will be here. And after the lecture, then we invite everyone to join us for our conference keynote reception, which is generously sponsored by Discover Ames. There will be refreshments, and you are also invited to view the conference posters, which discuss a variety of anaerobic digestion topics and are all around the room if you didn't get a chance to view them ahead of time. So with that, to introduce our speaker tonight, I will pass the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Craig Just, Donald E. Bentley Associate Professor in Engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Associate Faculty Research Engineer in the IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering Laboratory at the University of Iowa.
Hello, everyone. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. It's been a long time coming. The committee took a long time putting this all together, and I'm very tickled that this is happening now. I, too, will stay the whole time and get my card scanned on the way out. It's my pleasure to introduce Marcelo. Marcelo Mena is CEO of the Global Methane Hub, an international alliance for developing and implementing global methane reduction solutions. In 2021, he launched the Global Methane Pledge with over 110 countries, including the U.S., signing on to reduce methane emissions by more than 30% by the year 2030. Previously, Marcelo served as climate change advisor and practice manager for the World Bank, as minister and vice minister for the environment in Chile, and as co-chair for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. He is a recipient of awards from the United Nations Environment Program, Oceans Unite, National Geographic Society, and others for his work on promoting renewable energy, air pollution control, carbon taxation, and the creation of over 1 million square kilometers of marine protected areas and 45,000 square kilometers of national parks in Patagonia. A biochemical engineer by training, Marcelo received his PhD in environmental engineering from the University of Iowa. Now, I've known Marcelo for quite some time. I'm in my 31st year at the University of Iowa. I've known Marcelo for over 20 of those years. He was a force on campus then, whether it be at the radio station doing late night shows there, campaigns against coal on campus, epic poster called Coal or Classes, if I remember right, and had a coal pile the size of the old Capitol, saying this is the amount of coal we use in like a day or a month, I forget what it was, but this ability to take informed science and get it out into the public in the ways that evokes action. Mr. Action right here. And I think that to see in these last 20 some years, getting action done at the world stage has been amazing for me to see, and it's absolutely my honor to have Marcelo here speak to us today. So, Marcelo, and let's welcome him.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Craig, and thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here in Iowa. My home state in many ways. I live here almost 11 years, so yes. I'm going to talk to you about methane. It's the one that got away from me when I was, I remember when I was in the government. I just wanted to tell you that I do believe that on energy, we will be doing a lot of renewable energy. And I remember my child, who's 18 now wears a T-shirt that we designed while we were in school. It says Iowa Grown Energy, and it showed a wind turbine. And those years, it was only 2% of our energy, and now it's 64% of Iowa's energy. But 10 years ago, we also were saying that we should have a lot more solar energy in Chile. And it's been a decade, and it went from 0% to 35% of all our power today. And so I think we're in the middle of many revolutions. And so we'll have clean transportation, we'll have clean energy. But we have no way of determining whether we're going to have a net zero compatible food system. And so that's why I got into the Methane Hub. The first thing is that it's a global challenge, and I'll show you a little video, okay, about the methane pledge, which you're kind, Craig, to say that I didn't launch it. They hired me to run the Methane Hub. The methane pledge is a Joe Biden play with the EU, and I'll show you a little bit what the methane pledge is today.
Curbing methane is the single fastest way to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But without any action, methane emissions will rise as much as 13% above 2020 levels by 2030, driven by emissions from fossil energy, agriculture, and waste. That's why 103 countries launched the Global Methane Pledge at COP26, setting a collective goal of cutting these emissions by 30% by the end of the decade. Achieving this target will slow warming much faster than decarbonization efforts alone. Since its launch, the pledge has generated unprecedented momentum for methane action. The number of countries endorsing the pledge has grown to more than 150 countries. Dozens are developing national methane action plans to implement the pledge. And partners have launched efforts to drive methane reduction policies, projects, and finance in each of the 3 key methane emitting sectors through an energy pathway, a waste pathway, and a food and agriculture pathway. This is a decisive decade for climate action, and we all must do more to achieve or exceed the ambitious Global Methane Pledge, to avert the worst impacts of climate change, to improve energy and food security, and to save lives today. The Climate and Clean Air Coalition, UNEP International Methane Emissions Observatory, and dozens of others are stepping up to make resources available to partners across the globe. Together, we can achieve the pledge and keep a safe climate future within reach. Join us. Learn more at globalmethanepledge.org.
So that's the methane pledge, and I'm very proud to be working in it and working hand in hand with the State Department, with John Kerry's team and the EU and multiple other players. So you know by now that carbon dioxide is a big contributor to our warming that we've experienced, but there's also the short-term climate pollutants, many of them, HFCs and methane and black carbon, and they're all contributing to emissions. And the difference between methane and CO2, a lot of the emissions have been contributed to by the industrialized nations. 61% of existing warming is basically the U.S., the EU, Japan, and Russia. And so therefore there is this historical burden that is put upon industrialized nations. Since methane is short-lived, the warming that we're experiencing today from methane only occurred maybe 12 years ago. And so therefore it's whatever happened then. And that's actually the opposite. It's around 80% non-OECD countries. So it is about food, it is about waste, but it's about recent emissions from developing countries. So the dialogue is much different. And so we are working with the Methane Hub. We're funded by 26 philanthropies that help us deliver funding. And what we want to do is have a local benefit towards the action. Because it's really hard to go to India and to China or to Brazil and saying, it's actually you guys that are causing the problem, because actually, the history, the narrative is industrialized nations have really caused the problem. So this is a shared goal. But then the shared goal needs to have a local benefit. There has to be something in it for them to take action, and that's why we're working on this. And so one of the big things that we're doing is raising the prominence of methane, and it is a thing now. So we're sponsoring the Rice Congress. The enteric fermentation work is, with the USDA, the innovation sprints, and it's really great also to meet up and be able to work with Governor Vilsack's team. And I still call him Governor Vilsack because he was the governor when I was around here. So it's sort of this interesting thing of being, worlds collide and coming back together and working on this last challenge that we need to face. We're helping countries develop their action plans, and so many times it's no coincidence that this was overlooked sectors. When you know your energy system very well, or your cars, you're able to model all that. But how do you determine a way to mitigate methane in the waste sector? Is getting into super understudied sectors. If you're doing this in the agricultural sector, some countries don't even have the correct head of cattle or type of cattle, or whether they're dairy cattle or beef cattle. And so therefore there's so much to learn and unpack regarding these things. We also need to finance methane mitigation overall. I'll show you a little bit about that. And we can actually track everything. I'll just give you a short of it here. 40% of methane emissions come from fossil fuel extraction. And so therefore, a lot of these oil and gas wells and the coal mines are actually contributing to a lot of the warming. But if you think about it, food production and food waste covers the other 60%. So we cannot get away from it. Where these emissions are coming from, depends. The biggest emitter is China, but you also have the U.S. as the second biggest, and then you have a whole bunch of continents that are contributing to a lot of these emissions. And the challenge is that we know how to do a lot of these things, but some we just don't yet, or they're not cost effective. We have to come up with new methodologies to reduce those emissions. So technically feasible, agriculture, we could reduce emissions by 20-25%, but we need to have global emissions go down 30%, so we need new technologies that don't exist. Only 2% of mitigation in the agricultural sector, for example, is cost effective today. So we need to come up with these new solutions. So R&D is a really big part of what we do. But if we do so and we win this battle, we'll be able to have many measures that are done at low or negative cost, but we'll also be able to deliver twice the temperature reduction than decarbonization alone, but also bring in a whole bunch of local benefits. And I'll talk to you a little bit about them right now. So first off, agriculture. We hired the person who led the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, GRA, and New Zealand national, grew up on a farm, dairy farmer, knows how to speak these topics and won't come off as somebody that's disconnected to the needs of farmers overall. And our approach is actually to look at win-wins that we could work together, but also looking at new solutions and actually encouraging company action through different ways of saying, maybe Maybe JBS, the major meat producer, should have a net zero plan that counts for the cows. Because usually they're like, well, we'll have our net zero, butcher or whatever slaughterhouse, but you have to account for the animals, and you can't outsource them. They're part of your scope. So a lot of that work we're doing too. So where the emissions are coming from, yes, we're in a manure management anaerobic digestion discussion today. But it is about the enteric fermentation. So we could do a lot of things about reducing the emissions in the ag sector, but if we don't do fundamentally change the emissions from the cow gut, the ruminants, we're not going to get too much into success. So we are doing a big effort on anthropogenic emissions, with basically cow emissions being the highest. And we're trying to study the rumen a lot more. And so one of the things when I'm talking about win-wins is that we are actually trying to improve productivity in different locations. And the concept is that many times in different places, animals are being fed suboptimal food, and they spend a lot of their energy processing the food instead of making milk. And so that is ineffective. So you can see here a plot that indicates that an animal in sub-Saharan Africa actually creates 5 times more methane per unit of milk. And so we could gain so much if we're able to improve the productivity and actually provide income for the farmer that will have a better, more effective animal. And that makes a lot of sense. And that allows us to be able to work in places like in South Asia or in Africa or even in East Asia or Brazil, in which an animal produces 3 times more methane per unit of milk than one in the US or in the EU. But that's not going to cut it. And so one of the things that we're doing, and it's already been launched, and we're going to continue to show some of the progress, is the Enteric Fermentation Research and Development Accelerator, which is a $200+ million effort that we've been able to do to have the private sector, philanthropies, and governments invest in one coordinated effort until we get and crack that nut and have a lower emission solutions for ruminants. And so it could be something as studying the rumen microbiology, maybe gene editing the rumen gut for a new animal so it'll have lower emitting microflora, or maybe having vaccines that target methanogens and use that as a way, or the things that you may have heard already about the seaweed. But yeah, cows don't like the seaweed that much, and so we got to figure out a way. There's a reason why they don't eat it naturally, and so we got to figure out ways that the reductions of emissions actually last, are safe for people, and we don't have negative impacts. And the other thing is that how do we deliver these feed additives, right? In Brazil, in Argentina, maybe you see the animal once every 6 months, and you need to be constantly feeding them and actually monitoring those emissions, and so therefore it's a huge challenge on delivery. So I think it's a really important thing that we finally have the best scientists in the world collaborating together, knowing that they're not going to be getting one grant that's going to phase out, but we're going to be there for the long run until we crack that nut and we have those lower costs, but also improving productivity. Because if we're able to stop that cow burp from occurring, there's a chance that we'll be higher productivity because it is sort of an energy loss that we could actually prevent from happening. So we hope that works. But also, we were able to talk for the first time with ag ministers. One of the things that I did at the World Bank was because I always think about incentives. Maybe I think a little bit of an economist, even though a lot of economist friends would laugh at that premise, given the fact that historically in Chile, I'm known for having big fights with economists and cabinet members that I work with. If you Google that, you'll see that's a little bit of the story. I caused the resignation of all the economic ministers when I pulled the plug on a big project, and it was a big scandal. But I don't want to fight anymore, and so what I did in the World Bank was to think about what would economy ministers or finance ministers want to do as a leadership space within the climate world. And we came up with the Helsinki Principles and the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, which today has over 70 members, including Secretary Yellen, but including Olaf Scholz, who's now the Chancellor of Germany. So we were able to understand and think what these guys want. And a lot of the things that you might have heard about climate-related financial disclosures and the SEC requirements and the Fed asking about climate risk has to do a lot with that work. So we did that, and that was good. But ag ministers also want to be part of the solution, and being able to talk to them and listen to them, what would it take for them to really commit and actually address the problem and not beat around the bush, but say, yes, there is this thing called methane coming from cows, and we got to deal with it. And usually, when you talk to an ag minister, they're like, we're carbon neutral, right? I mean, which is not really true, right? In the sense that there's, agriculture isn't carbon neutral. We have to improve it. But we also say we want to work with you. We don't want to go against your benefit. I mean, we want to find something that's in it for you. And the way to do it is that improved productivity, that improved, because why would we want to do it any other way? So we were able to have this first ag minister meeting in Chile, and we had the U.S., Brazil, Australia, Uruguay, and Argentina, which account for 25% of all livestock emissions, commit to work together to have better solutions, and having the $200 million in R&D to help lower the cost really was a good thing overall. In energy, there's other things that we need to be doing, and one thing is that the problem is that these leaks of emissions are actually not being addressed. When you have last year in which energy prices went up to the roof, you still had a whole bunch of leaks because it didn't really matter because they're making so much money that why would I plug that leak? And so we have to find new ways to approach this. And first off, we're working in everywhere, right? And one of the things that we did, for example, is working with the Chinese government. And we supported a coalition of 9 NGOs and working in the most difficult sectors, have these big meetings with Minister Xie, from the lead of the Chinese government on climate. Here we are in the Shaanxi region, which is the coal country that actually emits as much methane in that region as the rest of all the coal mines in the world combined. So we're able to crack the nut there. We're able to work with the community. I think we will be actually getting a bigger chance to meet the 1.5 degree target. So we have put together this big coalition to help the Chinese government understand and have a commitment. And next week, or if it's maybe this week, when President Biden meets Xi Jinping in APEC in San Francisco, if they talk climate, because they talk about a whole bunch of stuff way above my pay grade, if they talk climate, they're going to talk about methane, and that methane action plan will have been funded by the support of the Methane Hub overall. We also put together
From above Earth
this thing called the Methane Alert Response System, and I'll show you what it is right now.
From above Earth, satellites provide an exciting opportunity to tackle climate change. Satellites can help us monitor emissions of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas and the second biggest driver of global warming. This is the reason why UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory announced its groundbreaking Methane Alert and Response System, or MARS, at COP27. MARS is the first global system providing actionable and transparent data on methane emissions thanks to satellites. In near real time, it then alerts companies and governments about large sources of this potent gas. MARS will first focus on very large methane emission sources from the energy sector. With more satellites coming online, MARS will be able to detect smaller plumes and expand to other methane-emitting sectors such as waste and livestock. This innovative project will incentivize companies and governments to credibly reduce their methane emissions and contribute to limit the rise of global temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade in line with the Paris Agreement. Because to unlock the fullest and fastest potential to reduce emissions, it is vital to have a better understanding of where and how much methane is being released. This is where the International Methane Emissions Observatory, or IMEO, comes in. As an independent and trusted data entity, IMEO integrates data from diverse sources, including satellites. Thanks to MARS, we have a new powerful tool to reduce methane emissions. After all, curbing methane emissions is the single fastest way to tackle climate change in the short term and move towards a net zero world. From above,
we'll see methane alert response system in action next year, but we've already seen what it could do. So, for example, this is a well in Argentina, in Vaca Muerta, and it's making something that was invisible visible. And this relentless spotlight on these emissions, basically, the understanding is that they warned the company that there's some information was measured. They tell them, plug that leak, stop that venting, and the information will go public regardless. And so therefore, you may have heard. Well, I'm in this world. I got this Google alert with methane, so I don't miss any methane thing news. But essentially, Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan have these massive emissions of methane because they're just venting stuff, and they have very little civil society in the case of Turkmenistan, which is a obscure dictatorship in which there's not like environmentalism there. But the fact that we are putting the spotlight there all the time has actually put pressure on them to join the Global Methane Pledge. Also, with this information, we started seeing that these methane leaks, if they're high, they could actually put the natural gas fuel as a transition fuel very much under question. And so because countries want to have a net zero pathway that's credible, for example, the EU, the same way that they are putting a tax on the pollution for the high emitting commodities that they might bring in from China, for example, they're also putting an emission standard to what they import. So if they're, which makes sense in this, because if you're going to adopt a standard for yourself, you probably want your competitors to have that same standard, right? It makes sense in a globalized, free market economy that we hold each other to the similar standards. And so the methane import standards, for example, themselves, if they apply them, it could reduce global methane emissions by 1/3. It could meet 1/5 of the global methane pledge, and actually it could be one of the most effective things that we could have at hand, because it will, it doesn't matter whether your country has an emission standard or not. If you want to reach the European market, that's something that you're going to have to be able to you're going to have to be able to accredit that your emissions were reduced. And the same way, then, the U.S. is working with the EU, with Australia, with Korea, with Japan, and even little old Chile, saying, we want an low emissions oil and gas market, because we do not want that transition fuel to actually be undermining the efforts in reducing temperature. So we're working also with the UN presidency, the COP28 presidency, and so we will probably hear major oil and gas companies in the world committing to near zero methane, but the days of self-reporting are over. This will come with a satellite platform that will provide integrity for these commitments, so they're not greenwashing things that will just disappear. The other thing that we do a lot is, I really think it doesn't get old, is making these with optical gas imaging cameras. We're able to show those methane leaks and actually provide communities information so they could defend themselves from polluting oil and gas operations that might expose them to carcinogenic benzene, or the burning of these flares sometimes cause particulate matter. And so we're using that so they defend themselves and from those polluting activities. On waste, which is more directly related to everything we're talking about right now, I think there's a big thing that has been going on, is that with these satellite images, we're finally seeing something I personally did not know, that these landfills, when they're mismanaged, they could actually be some of the biggest point sources of methane in the world. And the story here is I took this picture in Ghazipur in Delhi. I had heard about this landfill in Delhi that would catch fire. This was in the middle of the city. This is where they butcher animals, right? There's a church right here. And it's a 20-story high open dump. And it catches fire every once in a while. And when temperatures rise, these methane emissions rise. And so it's very negative if you're Prime Minister Modi and you're having dignitaries coming in for the G20 and you have a soot-filled sky because of the trash is burning. And so it very much goes against their own self-image. And so we have a lot of work. And the reason why this happens is because the organic waste in the trash decomposes to form that methane. And as we have more and more heat waves, the problem will get worse. And only 1 year ago, because I like to think about like many of these things have changed so much, and our understanding of things have come so fast. 1 year ago, a paper by Esron on, I think, Science Advances. The Esron is like the Netherlands space agency. They showed the big emissions from the major landfills in the world, and 28 tons an hour of methane is brutal. Just think about 6 tons an hour is maybe $10 million in natural gas, right? So this is so much energy being lost and wasted. And this is equivalent to 1.4 million cars in one place. So now we have the technology to really look at how to address these things. And to me, it's a dream in a way, because when I was a grad student at Iowa, I would work with NASA trying to track pollution through space, through continents with aircraft, and using modeling to see where the plume would be from the biomass burning from the Amazon, or from the influx from China, or from the power plants in the iron belt. We would do all that work, and we would use the satellite to compare with the aircraft and figure out whether they matched. But we never had the technology for methane, because methane really does stick out as a sore thumb. Carbon dioxide has a very the noise, so the signal to noise ratio is a little bit more difficult. Right now, we're probably having 800 ppm of CO2. If you're in a park, maybe it'd be 350. If you're in a big city with a traffic jam, maybe it's 800 again. But methane, the signal to noise ratio is way more distinct, and I'll show you a little bit. And myself, I also had my own landfill fires that I had to address when I was in government. And it was really frustrating not to be able to really predict that. And I did air quality forecasting systems to prevent pollution on the normal day, but this I could not predict, and it was very frustrating to me. So when I started looking at my friends from Carbon Mapper is a NGO from a NASA scientist, Riley Duran, and he was from NASA JPL, and they developed this satellite that's going to be launched next year in March, and it will really dramatically improve our capacity to measure methane emissions globally in terms of coverage and frequency of measurements. And so what I thought was really interesting is that the Sunshine Canyon landfill in Los Angeles was subject to dozens of complaints from the neighbors that live right there because of its foul smell. And so with that data, they were able to see where the leaks were coming, and they were able to do interventions and covering the line, wherever the methane was leaking, be able to have a control of those emissions. And that's something that I think we could actually do in Mumbai. And so we actually put together this thing called the Waste Map, which was launched at Climate Week a couple weeks ago. We got additional funding from Google.org, and we will link the satellite information with a municipality, with an NGO that will help the municipality have better policies to reduce the existing emissions from the landfills, plus prevent new ones from occurring through other policies, for example, organic waste diversion, which will ultimately lead to anaerobic digestion or composting. And we did that for different places in Chile, and also, of course, I couldn't help myself to do that. And we had the Carbon Mapper aircraft come down to our own landfills that we thought were not very big emissions, but then all of a sudden we got these massive emissions, 2 tons an hour, of places that, sometimes I never even heard of. I mean, this one here, almost 1 ton an hour. This is a small town that nobody knows, right? And I'm pretty sure you guys could go to data.carbonmapper.org, and you could look at which ones are detected here in Iowa. And you'll see that there's many sources around the world, and we need to address them all and stop existing emissions, but also prevent new emissions from occurring. But there's also a new thing that's coming up I think is really important, and that you also were aware of. Last year, there's this conference on biodiversity in Montreal, and there's a commitment that all countries did, which is, besides the fact of protecting 30% of the world's land and oceans, which is a great thing to do, because if you want to have better biodiversity, if we don't want to be stuck in pandemics because of zoonotic disease that expands because of our lack of balance with ecosystems in which we get exposed to these vectors. The thing that did happen is that they committed to reduce food waste in half. It's really important because there's new accounting that actually tells us, which makes total sense, that half of food systems emissions comes from food that nobody ever ate. And whether it's because the product didn't get to market or whether we had a portion size that was not possible to digest, or because it ends up in the trash and decomposes and creates methane, all those things are actually half of food system emissions. So who would be against it, right? It goes for food security, and we're doing a whole bunch of support on food banking, having regulations for food banking to be, for food to be donated, not destroyed, or actually working in some places so the cold chains are more effective, so the more product gets to market, or electrifying places so people could have refrigeration, so they could sell a frozen fish instead of a cured one, because there wouldn't be any other technology. So I think these are the type of things that you come in to India, to Africa, and it's like, this is not this sort of moral imperative that we have to do this because it's the right thing. We do it because it's better income for the farmer. It's less landfills that catch fire. It's less pollution that's exploding. In the case of China, the coal mine, it's in their benefit to reduce that methane because it will reduce the risk of explosion of these underground mines too. So it's always looking at what it's in it for them. If you want people to follow you because it's the right thing to do, I'm sorry, it's probably not going to be the best way to get a lot of support. It has to be in it for them, and that's the approach. So the other things that we're figuring out, we're not doing nearly enough on what we need to do on methane. Yes, we have substantial funding for this, but it's not nearly enough. Philanthropy puts in $10 billion a year on climate, $100 million on methane, 1%. It's contributed nearly half the warming, only 1% of the funding. So we still need to do a lot more. And the sectors that we're doing it, we're doing it all wrong. So, for example, we're only spending 1% of our funding in the energy sector when it's 40% of the problem. And the things that we're doing in the other sectors are actually not even good, right? I mean, like, we're accounting for like landfilling as to be like a methane abatement solution. And what I showed you now is not necessarily the case, right? And so, therefore, what we're doing is working with different MDBs, multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the IADB, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And so therefore, we're helping them hire staff so they, instead of going about supporting them, countries to do another landfill, they'll know that something else is different. And they will have the funding to design an anaerobic digester or a composting facility, and the business model to accompany that so it works and it's not just a one-off. And with a lot of South-South collaboration, because many of these things are done in low-income environments, and the collaboration among these environments is really important. And so we have a project preparation facility for Latin America. We're going to do one in Africa. Recently, we're going to approve a grant in India. So all these cities know that they could do something different, that they don't have to do what they call scientifically managed landfills, but they could actually do something that's more truly circular. So we're doing things where it counts, Global South overall, and we have a global reach. The only places we haven't gotten into are places that nobody could get into, but we are trying to find ways to work and collaborate in India, in China, in Latin America, in Africa, in Australia, and in each place we're doing the thing that we think needs to be done. Here, I got extra slides that I think are probably not pertinent, but I'll just find a last one. That's where we're doing our grants. Basically a lot of the things that we're doing are in the Global South, and we have a Global South-oriented team to do that, because it's way different if it was like, if it was the U.S. State Department going down to Africa saying, you know what, guys, it was you guys all along that were causing the climate change problem. That doesn't fly, so it has to be among peers that we work. So that's what I got for you guys today. Thank you for listening.
Who's got a question? Here we go. Right here.
Michael Schopenhauer, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So the question that I have is regarding the satellite, and we're looking forward certainly for the new EDF NEVA satellite to go up there, which is, I think, the one that you talked about.
Carbon mapper and methane sat I forgot to talk about, yes.
Sorry?
Methane sat is the EDF. There's two.
There's
methane
two.
sat and carbon mapper are coming up on the same aircraft. Hopefully nothing happens.
Okay, can you talk?
Well, we're not hedging our bets here.
Can you talk about the resolution and the pixel size? Because the problems that we have with the existing Tropomi is that the pixel size is way too large, with 7.5 kilometers, and the GHG set system out of Canada has the right pixel size, but it's about 40 times less sensitive than the Tropomi. Tropomi has the right sensitivity, too large pixel. The other one has the right pixel size, but too low sensitivity. Where are those two satellites going to be? And that's relevant because the both Tropomi as well as GHGSat are not able to capture with enough resolution agricultural emissions, either rice as an aerial emission or manure from animals.
Yes, so we're talking about Carbon Mapper is going to launch 2 satellites next year. That should be around 10 for us to get the full coverage we want for real tracking of emissions that are not just operational improvements, but we could use for emissions inventories overall. So Carbon Mapper, I think, is like 20 meters resolution, which I think is a lot better than, you could really see where the leak is going to be. Methane sat, I'm not exactly sure, but I understand but it's similar. But methane sat versus Carbon Mapper, they're both complementary. Methane sat is more aerial emissions, like more basin-wide emissions, whereas Carbon Mapper is more like the point source overall for a specific facility. So there's going to be a whole bunch of challenges of like being able to link who owns this asset, and actually know a lot more information about what is occurring. So we're funding the Global Energy Monitor also to do other databases, so that way when that information is available, we'll know this is owned by Exxon and this is permitted this year and it has this capacity, so we're able to cross over and estimate methane leaks rates instead of just the tons per hour of emissions. So methane sat is supposed to be able to have some sort of aerial emission estimation, and we'll hopefully have that be done, and that will give you an opportunity to do non-CAFO, because you can measure CAFOs, non-CAFO emissions. But I understand the Carbon Mapper is also going to try to have like non-CAFO aerial emissions for agricultural emissions. So that's a little bit of the bet, but I wouldn't bank on it in the short term. I think there's going to be a lot more measurements required for us to be confident on agricultural emissions. So I think in situ measurements of like the animals themselves are going to be a way to keep track of how effective other solutions are. But your satellites, that's good. That's great. Yeah. And we work with GHGSat and Tropomi. So.
Thank you, Dr. Mena, for your work. Lisa Schulte-Moore, Iowa State University. So we hear a lot about different measures of global warming potential, like GWP 10, 25, 100, GWP star. Can you tell us a little bit about those different methods of estimating potential and from the standpoint of the AD industry, like what one should we be looking at?
Right. It's a very important and loaded question because it is exactly like a very difficult thing to address. So what the question is, GWP 20 and 100, basically carbon dioxide has an atmospheric lifetime, but if you want to compare pears and apples, you have to have the same time horizon under which how much warming they're causing. And so GWP 100 makes sense if you want to look at long-term warming because carbon dioxide has a long, almost century plus duration, but methane only has 12 years. So how do we compare the 12-year and the 100-year? It's with GWP 20, which is 25 to 1, right? So 1 unit of methane is 25 to 1. But in the short term, GWP 20, the 20-year warming potential, it's closer to 86. So if you are thinking the short term, let's say India 12% of their emissions are from methane in the 100-year realm. If you do in the next 20 years, this is how much warming India will contribute to the next 20 years, is actually closer to 40%, right? And so it changes the sectors that are important dramatically. So you cannot ignore ag, or you cannot ignore waste, and it becomes way more important. So, but I'm saying this is loaded because obviously all the ag-heavy countries are very well aware and would totally, because UN works on consensus, would totally block any attempt to go into GWP 20 because it would make agriculture be much more important and put the burden on agricultural sector in a much higher rate. And that's politically inviable. We're in Iowa, so we I didn't say more. But the important thing, though, is temperature, though, I think is a way that we could really get around that. So temperature is like, yeah, do you care about these next 20 years of warming? Well, methane mitigation gets you 2/10 of a degree lower warming, whereas decarbonization alone only 1/10 of a degree. So I think the way that we could really agree is just to think about temperature. What do we need to keep 1.5 alive? And methane is a big part of that problem. And you don't have to do the whole metrics game. And I have a I've spent way too many hours working with my ag director, and he convinced me actually to this point. The first thing I said was do GWP 20, but that's dead on arrival in COP. The Brazilians are ready. They've been preparing for this fight for all their life, yeah.
Hello, I'm Hussein Ali. I'm from University of Texas at Arlington. I have a question like, do you think there should be a hierarchy on how to tackle the emissions from the developing countries? Because like, instead of going for like the newest technologies, like the technologies that have been existing for for some years can solve a lot of problems. Like Pakistan doesn't have a single sanitary landfill that can collect the methane emissions, and the most of our waste is organic waste, and all of that is getting dumped like in open dumps, and that is producing a lot of methane emissions. So instead of going for like a fancier solution, why not like fund these countries to make sanitary landfills? And one other thing is that a lot of politicians, they don't want to work on that because they want to build roads with the money because that's what people can see. So how can you, like, by these pledges that all these countries make, how can you force them to work on these things? They're not going to get them votes, but they're going to save some lives.
I mean, so I think one of the big landfills is Lahore landfill, and one of the major emitters, I think, is like 8 tons an hour, just massive emissions. I got to say, like 20 years ago, when I was getting my PhD at Iowa, and even when I got out of college, one of my first jobs was running an anaerobic digester, and I would take my students when I was a young professor and show them a landfill and show the power that could be generated. But then there's a thing I didn't realize. The theoretical capture is 60%, right? That landfill that I saw put aside, that's the 40%. That is, so I think down the line, we should have really realized that covering a gas with dirt maybe wasn't that going to be that effective. I mean, we're going to have leak. There's always going to be leaking. And so I do think down the line, for sanitary purposes, for like having your water not be polluted, having, like in India, like animals eating the waste, all these things, those things make a true point. We should do sanitary engineering and landfills for that purpose. But in hindsight, I think we should do organic waste diversion altogether. And instead of landfilling nutrients, right, that catch fire every once in a while, we should probably try to, do a true circular economy. My country in Chile is facing a desert with climate change. If we have 5,000 tons a day of composting that we could use to help fight desertification, I think that's actually a win. If we think about the fluctuations of food prices because of the Ukraine war last year and how that impact it caused, when we were able to figure out really providing nutrients with our waste, I think that's probably the better solution down the line. Otherwise, we'll just have a landfill that will catch fire eventually, and it will be a problem. And the other thing that I don't support either is incineration. I think it's also anti, circular economy too.
saw you first.
My name is Ron Tigner. My first major in college is animal science, and I grew up on a farm with livestock, lived next to a state park, had a lot of wildlife, including deer all around me during all my years growing up. And later I went and completed an environmental studies program, which included meteorology and climatology and earth science courses. I feel that livestock production is maybe getting misaligned, getting a bad rap. So I decided to look up some information. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated there were 60 million bison in the United States, North American bison in the United States prior to settlement. We have about 90 million dairy and beef cattle in the United States currently. The bison are probably about 40% larger in size than a lot of the livestock, and they live a short life. They do beef cattle in a feedlot compared to bison. They don't eat the long stem forages year-round. They don't consume as much feed, so they don't ruminate as much. So my question is, does anybody have any real understanding of how much all the bison produce for methane as compared to today's current dairy and beef herds? And also, when you look at pre-settlement, you'd have large herds of elk and deer and antelope and moose, which also were ruminants putting out methane. And so maybe the native population of wildlife produce more methane than the current dairy and beef cattle, which they've been for decades and decades working on feed efficiency through genetics and nutrition for a long time. There's a product called Rumensin that's been out for years and years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know about the historical emissions. What I know is that recent emissions are, the big contribution to the existing system. And there's nothing I said today that actually spoke against livestock at all. But, in the ways that we got to do it is that we have to do it more efficiently. The things that I said were improving the productivity so an existing farmer could get a lot more out of their current animal. So our approach isn't against livestock at all. It's about reducing the emissions and actually improving income from farmers. So that's the approach, and that's the approach designed by also a dairy farmer himself, Hayden, who's out there in Uruguay trying to fix this problem himself too.
Hi, I have a question. So the image of emission of methane you have shown, is it like I don't know how it is captured. Is it dynamic feature? For example, is it a single snapshot or it's taken average over
the satellite.
Is it average over a few days or months?
All I showed was snapshots, but there's high variability data that we're purchasing to be able to see what fluctuations exist. So, for example, landfills, there's clearly a whole bunch of variables that make it be higher or lower: temperature, humidity, the organic fraction, whether you put a whole bunch of new fresh organic waste or whatever. There's multiple things, and we're just scratching the surface. For the first time, Esron, with the Tropomi measurements, they did a couple of snapshots. Now we funded them to do monthly measurements to see if there's variability, because we do need to understand this a lot more. And so GHCSAT, for example, only measures maybe once a week or once a month, and you have to point to these sources. So we need to really get into the understanding whether these emissions are sporadic or whether they're permanent.
Just one more question. So in your talk, I was just wondering, is there what is the contribution of wildfire or crop burning, the contribution of methane from these kind of cause, because it's a natural sources of.
You're right. You're right. And even wood burning, for example, open wood burning, like a chimney, has substantive methane emissions too. It's a lot of uncertainties, and I'm pretty convinced, but I don't have the evidence yet, because you can't observe it with a satellite because there's much more aerial emissions, right? We know that there's a lot more methane existing when there's a big fire, where there's a big ag burning, and so, yeah, that's a sweet spot. I still want to get in there because that's both of them. Black carbon and methane exist from these very bad, negative practices that we've all accepted, which is agriculture burning, right? I think, it's never going to be positive to burn your crops. And I think, doing anaerobic digestion here or doing bioenergy but letting it burn, open burning, is probably the worst thing that we could do for climate and for soil health too, right? So it's a lot, but we just don't know enough yet.
Okay, folks, I think we're at time. Let's thank Marcelo again. Thank you.